Nexus PMG welcomes you to the Bigger Than Us podcast, which we as energy geeks lovingly refer to as the BTU. Bigger Than Us is a podcast that focuses on ideas that will shape the future of our planet and ultimately our existence. We will occasionally lean into energy topics because, after all, it's the key to our collective survival. But we'll also explore other ideas and topics that we believe will have an impact that is bigger than us. And now, on to today's show. Hello, and welcome to the Bigger Than Us podcast. I'm your host, Raj Daniels, and today I'd like to welcome Corey Glickman to the show. Corey Glickman is Vice President and Head of the Infosys Sustainability and Design business, which develops and deploys smart space technologies at private and public organizations. Corey has over 35 years of experience in industry consulting, providing advice on technology and business. He is an expert in strategic design, digital transformation, customer experience strategy, and the use of visualization applied to the development of innovative products, processes, and services. Corey is a member of the World Economic Forum Pioneer Cities Working Group, and he is also a Singularity University faculty expert guest lecturer. Corey, how are you doing today?
Hi, Raj. I'm doing fine. Glad to be here.
Corey, I'm excited to dig into this conversation, and especially with your background, I had a choice of places to start, and I decided to start here. Tell me about working with or being mentored by Fred Rogers.
That's a great question. So the opportunity of meeting Fred Rogers, let alone being mentoring by him, is a unique opportunity, I think, for many individuals. Though it may not be so uncommon in circles in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I live, and that's where he is from and where his show was created. Early on in my career, one of my first jobs was with public television, which is WQED here in Pittsburgh. And I remember on my first day of work, I came in as a designer. So that would be a production designer, someone who creates promotions for shows, actually designs show sets, gets to do some television production eventually, editing, all these very interesting objects and things to do. And my first day in the building, I actually get on an elevator. And who's in the elevator? It's Fred Rogers. And I was speechless, not because I'm like awed. I'm just thinking, here's a individual who I've seen since I've probably been 5 years old, right? That I can remember. Right? It's probably one of the few TV shows that my parents would probably leave me alone in a room saying, we're safe to leave him in a room, with this TV show because of the messaging that's coming across here. And I don't think we said anything the first day across there. But eventually, what had happened as I started to work on shows and got to know him, we became, very close. He's very much in person is the personality that you had seen, on TV, as millions of people had seen on TV, and his messaging around who you are and it's okay to be, et cetera, et cetera. And what was absolutely fascinating, what we don't often, I think, give credit to people like Fred Rogers, is he was truly a pioneer, both not just socially, but also technology-wise. Because when Fred graduated, into a professional world, he was actually a minister. So he was destined to go work in a church or in community service. And I know he spent his first 1 or 2 years doing so. And he actually came up with the idea of, I can do this on television. And it wasn't so much about preaching or delivering religious messages or community service messages, as opposed to saying, I can have this medium where I can connect with individuals, particularly children, and relay messages, and through this use of technology, which to that date, if you have any people that that were watching television in the 50s or 60s, or maybe there are shows that you've seen about Fred Rogers, back then television had a lot of slapstick, right? There's a lot of things like clowns or Three Stooges and other things like that. And he was saying this medium can be so much more. So he made a conscious decision that his goals and mission of what he intended to do through connecting with people would have a much broader amplification through television, which was the technology. It had never been really done before, let alone commercially or technically. and he crafted a whole genre and approach which has held up for 40, 50 years, and still holds up. People will still watch those reruns across there. And he was very, very consistent. So having him as a mentor that not only talked about consistency and being able to amplify what you do, but more importantly, embracing technology, uh, understanding, how to have very difficult conversations through there. It is important. I know one of the things that I talked about earlier is I said I specialized in special effects. So when you're in the 1980s, special effects, the zenith at that point, were things that were happening with George Lucas and Steven Spielberg and Star Wars. I actually had the opportunity to do a project with both of them through public television, and it was an amazing, experience to go ahead and do this. And of course, both of them, who did they want to meet? They wanted to meet Fred Rogers, right? Because they too grew up with it, and their kids grew up with it. And I remember the four of us were actually in a having a lunch, off to the side, off the soundstage, and I was thinking, wow, okay, so I'm working at a public TV station. I'll never have the money or the resources or the reach of what Lucas is doing or Spielberg. And I remember Fred talking to me and just saying, you can still be that level of impact. You just have to do that within the realm and the circles that you have and coming across there. And that's always been a really, really interesting lesson for me. And that's often what I talk to people about, that it's not so much the, being a big fish in a small pond or a small fish in a big pond. It's about having the impact that you can create within the areas that you are, and that you will find mentors, and you yourself should become a mentor to help pass those messages along.
It's a great lesson. You mentioned, he made a conscious decision. When did you make a conscious decision to get involved with design, or what drew you to design?
So, really interesting question, and I will give you a very honest answer. There were two main influences. So, first off, when I was in high school level, I was one of those students that pretty much was straight A's and had the ability to meet a lot of opportunities, both scholastically and athletically, and had a lot of choice of what I could do. And one of those opportunities actually was in physics. And I had a professor in high school who actually got me associated with Princeton University while I was a junior in high school. And I was able to take classes in physics at Princeton while I was still going to high school. So physics was a big deal for me because my family's very scientific and engineering wise. And as I was going further and further working on quantum physics of all things, one of my mentors there was a guy named Bob Roth. And Bob Roth, once again, a Star Wars connection here. He was the gentleman who worked for Lucas, who figured out the village of Tatooine. So this whole idea of how do you create this village that doesn't exist, right? That's the city, right? That's there. And they actually used physics to figure out how the camera works and how do you do that perception and size. So I got to work on parts of that with them, right? As part of physics problems. And it was super, super, interesting. And just as you can imagine, thinking this is what I want to do. And as we started to talk more about science, we started talking about the importance of design. And he said, you need to go to design school because design school has you think about projects in a different way across there. And it's very true. Design is extremely hard and complex. I ended up going to the Art Institute of Pittsburgh afterwards, and it was how can I say it? It was a very good school, but it was not like a typical academic institution. Your grades didn't matter from an academic perspective, but your ability to create and to defend your project and to be judged, and the ability to solve organizationally through here. So if you think about things like physics, it's often there's formulas, there's theorems, there's lots of math, and there's experimentation and the whole scientific process. The design process isn't that different, except design is a bit more control of creativity, where you say, I have a problem to solve. What are the pieces I can create or gather? And how can I ultimately take enough control of those pieces in order to get the result that I want to get to? And what happens with design, because it is creative in most systems, it's very judgmental. right? It's not always scientifically proved, but it's always judged. We all know what we like and what we don't like. We all make decisions every day across there. So using a design process was very, very important to me, and it was very competitive. Suddenly, you are competing against all kinds of individuals or all kinds of problem sets. And I think this actually has a lot to do with the resurgence of design thinking, 5, 6 years ago, that businesses are realizing that design is a very important organizational matter. So that's the first reason. The second reason is a much shorter answer. I met a very beautiful girl in design school, and that had a big influence. And that's worked out too. I've been married for 40 years to her, so that certainly had a big play.
Well, congratulations. Maybe we can do another episode on designing long-lasting marriages.
There you go.
I'm fascinated by design. Offline when we were speaking, I mentioned that I had my own software company that I launched back in 2014. I became, really embedded in the world of UX, UI, user experience, and did some reading around design. And I often wonder, maybe you have an answer to the question, but why isn't design more emphasized in high school classes or environments? I try to tell my kids all the time that, look at the environment you're in, whatever environment we're in, or whatever you use, whether it be a spatula to cook with or even a building, someone somewhere for some reason has designed this object or this environment for you to be in. Why do you think it's not more emphasized in school?
Yeah, I think that's truly interesting, and I think it's a great observation. I think that design, at least where you would start to maybe get serious about it, would be at a high school level, like for most students before they would make a decision to go to college. And then when they
Hmm.
go to college, the parents saying, "Really, you're going to design school?
Right.
Yeah, get a job, right?" But what's really interesting about it is this. So when you look at schools right now, they'll talk about right? They'll talk about STEM programs, right?
Hmm.
So science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. That's what we need. And then some curriculums, actually, they now call it STEAM, where they're putting the arts in there. But generally, schools, I think budgetary wise, they always think of art and music as electives, right? They're things that you're doing when you're not taking the hardcore classes that you're required to take across there. And yet, if you think about, especially now, how much of our life is run by designers? I just saw the latest Marvel movie, right? Ten Rings, and like every typical movie at the end, you see the literally 3,000 names, right, going
Hmm.
across the screen of all of the animators and the musicians and the directors and the photographers and the rotoscope artists, and then the whole product itself was created by Disney, right, and Marvel and Pixel Studios. And when people aren't watching the movie, they're on their phones, right, and they're looking at social websites. And if we think about how much impact designers have on the majority of our lives right now of what we're saying is taking place, right? It's everything that most of the generation admires is what is that next great movie, or what is that great entertainment, or the ability to see an amazing concert, or the fact that I have a car that behaves in a certain way, it's autonomous or it has a certain style, or what are the clothes that I'm wearing, the things that we have are there. And I think it's somewhat ironic that designers have taken over the world, but I don't think that's a new thing. If you think about the museums that we all visit, what populates most of our museums, right? If it's not a natural history museum that's full of dinosaurs or perhaps other areas, it's all about the artwork, right? Over the millennials, there seems to be a things that society, treasures the most, or even engineering, I would say, is design. So I think deep down we know this. I think that the part of the issue might be getting good designers to teach at a level beneath college. I think once you get to the college level and university level, you could get into really great design programs, right? But I think it's at the high school level that we don't have enough very good designers that are teaching.
And to your point, every part of our life is, depending on your view, either influenced by or manipulated by design. So I agree with you. I hope that as we progress and people realize just the influence of designers in our life, it does start coming up early in the education system.
What's surprising too is, so as you know, I work for a large consulting firm, technology consulting firm, Infosys. So it's 270,000 individuals. Most of if you looked at it from the outside, you say these are technologists, right? These are engineers, these are software designers, these are business consultants, and we run very large, complex programs. And we have close to 5,000 designers, which is a lot of people, but in a 270,000 person environment, that's a very small percentage. But I would clearly and openly say that people are always surprised, whether it's from the outside or from even our own teams, that the people who actually are designers or trained to design are the most organized people out there, right? That they know how to run large, complex situations. They can visualize, what's going to take place, just like a great athlete can visualize, what a performance would be across there. A lot of times there could be some fuzzy logic through there, but the good designers have science behind what they're doing too. So I have high
Absolutely.
hopes.
Now, I'm glad you brought up Infosys. Can you share with the audience an overview of Infosys and your role at the organization?
Certainly. So Infosys is one of the top 10 what we call IT services companies on the planet. Really great origins. Started in India in 1970s with a handful of money and 7 individuals in Bangalore. And at the time, Bangalore was a village, not much more than a village. Now, Bangalore is one of the largest cities in the world, and that had a lot to do with Infosys and the ability of the economy and the creation of what the company was able to do. So, if you think about the first Indian companies, what was their role, within the larger IT services consulting world? It was offshoring, right, and outsourcing certain kinds of activities through here. But as these companies started to mature, it switched, right? It was no longer just someone who was filling a gap in a delivery cycle for a Western company, but now it was a competitor. And the fact is that in India, most I don't want to generalize, but let's face it, there's a lot of people that say you're either going to become an engineer or a doctor. There's an incredible, schooling system and an incredible work ethic and also this huge social mandate. It's the 4th largest economy on the planet. It's the largest democracy. And there's a lot of work that still has to be done there. And I think when you're put in situations like that, the harder the problem to solve, the better the solution. So Infosys, along with several other Indian technology companies, have evolved to become very serious players of bringing innovation across there. So without going through the history of 30 or 40 years of what these technologies could, have done, what I can say is where we are now is that we're a digital transformation company. We're in 53 countries around the planet. As I said, we have 270,000 individuals who are doing work for almost any company that you can imagine. And that work is generally consulting and advisory, heavy technology design, both digital and physical. We have close to 20,000 what I call real engineers. These are mechanical, robotic, chemical, electrical engineers that are doing physical aspects of solutions because it's becoming more physical across there. We have strong consulting services that do everything from what financial, obligations to supply chain logistics across here. And the company, we have our own DNA paths. Is actually, I'm proud to say, is net carbon neutral now for 2 years. So we have been a leader in the sustainability field, both for our own operations and with our clients through here. And that wasn't something that said, okay, we need to do this now because this is what's important to the planet. We've actually did this starting in 2008 when the company was saying we need to grow. We're in a situation that we think we have the power to change and help society. And this is true. It's not just a line. We believe that as technologists and as the ability to work with many different kinds of companies, that we should do things in a certain ethical way. And that has become very much, the structure of what Infosys is about. So it is about doing technology for good. It is about having a non-Western view on the world and what technology can do for society. It's different if you're from a very wealthy country scenario that says I might be doing business because of profit and other things. It doesn't say Infosys doesn't have to profit. Every company should and does. But there's also a large social mandate to say, how do I create an economy for my country and for the hundreds of millions of people, right? That you are directly related to, and I think that's part of Infosys' heritage.
And your role at the organization?
So my title is Global Lead of Sustainability and Design. I had to make sure I had the design always in my title. Whatever I've done, I've made sure the design is always attached there. But what this basically means is that I am the head of sustainability for Infosys. And we have to think of sustainability really as two pieces. So there's this internal view that's around our operations. And there's a group of individuals that have been around since 2008 that have looked after the company to get us to where we are. I've been charged with building out and externalizing our capabilities and our knowledge and continue to grow those paths so that we can service clients. And that ranges from corporations to governments to institutions to academic entities on how we can deliver it. So that's one of three roles that I have. The second role that I have is I incubated a couple of years ago what we call our smart spaces practice. And that would be city infrastructure, buildings themselves, everything from how energy is used in buildings to how the buildings are designed, to the experiences that buildings have, to city traffic and mobility patterns. So it's another practice that I lead, and there's a lot of overlap between sustainability in there. And then I have, once again, a third practice, which I first came to the company for, and it's called strategic design consulting. And that one is a smallish tip of the spear group. Once again, I'm always going to have design, somewhere attached to whatever I go and do. And that is a unit that cuts across the entire company. It's a very small unit, but it does what's called tip of the spear work. It allows us to look at opportunities that may not make business sense, or perhaps doesn't have a clear, path of how this will benefit, but they're important things to look at. And they generally are looking at to say, is there a viable business model? Is there a truly feasible technology, and what would be the horizon for that? And the third, is it usable across there? And this allows us to try projects or try trends or invent trends or create living labs in ways that we think are interesting places to go. And it really then sets up for other parts of Infosys to then see if things can be scaled. So those are the three roles that I have.
Corey, it sounds to me like Fred Rogers' advice to you really came to fruition. Not only are you impacting or potentially impacting the 270,000 employees at Infosys, but by extension, I just can't imagine the number of people they're touching. So it sounds like what he said really stuck.
Yes, absolutely. And I've had several mentors, but yes, he's the one that I would name across there. And the point that you're making about that extension. So it's interesting on the KPIs that I have for are different for all three of these units. So the key performance indicator for the strategic design consulting is somewhat of a revenue marker, but it's very small. And it is much more about, are we looking at the right ideas? Are we, not resting, on our laurels, and are we willing to take risk? Okay, so that's I get measured on KPIs on this one, and then also, are we willing to take diversity as a talent, and have that kind of thinking, and try to install design beyond just talking about it. The KPIs for the smart spaces is very much a business KPI of revenue and utilization, and true business metrics that you would see with any business unit you're going across there. The sustainability unit has revenue KPIs also attached to it, but the number one KPI that I actually have is, how can we positively impact 80 million lives through what we do? And that's the goal for this year, okay? So that's kind of that extension you're talking about. 270,000 people, all the companies that they work for, all of the people that we work through, the companies themselves, what they can do. How can we start causing that flywheel to take place? And it has to be in a measurable path or pattern across there. So that's kind of that Fred Rogers, lessons coming back again.
Sounds like a great KPI, 80 million lives.
Yeah, that's for this year. I can't wait to see next year's KPI.
So let's move to the smart spaces practice. What does that look like? Does it come in form of an engagement with a client? Can you kind of frame that for us?
Sure. So let's define what a smart space is first. So a smart space could be a building, it could be something indoors, it could also be something outdoors. It could be a campus, it could be a sports arena, it could be a transit system, it could be a space station, right? So how do you take a space and bed data and intelligence within that space so that things start to automate, right through here. So if I think of a space in three areas, in smart spaces, one would be what can I do with assets, whether it's IoT assets or other pieces of technology that can start to automate systems in that building so that they can become optimized, whether it's for safety, whether it's dealing with COVID protocols, whether it's dealing with ingress and egress patterns of how people can enter and use a building, but ultimately it's about productivity. The second area has to do with a user experience. So I'm sure we've all hopefully have had the opportunity to go into buildings where it's easy to find where you're going. The elevators work in a timely manner. The security is there that makes you feel safe and comfortable in who you're working with and the areas that you're in. The ability for no breakdowns to happen, within the equipment around you. The ability to go into a conference room where it's automatically set up for you. So these are smart attributes that are about things to help you with your productivity and comfort levels. And then there's the third column, which would be in the sustainability category, that says that I'm running renewable energies if possible. I am getting 100% reclamation of my water. I have zero plastics. There's just a litany of sustainability components. So by using data and having these buildings start to automate, you can imagine that companies that own buildings or campuses, they want to do this because A, it helps with the sustainability, but more importantly, it's driving productivity and it makes it where people want to work. And it's just smart, right, of how these buildings work across there. Think of these buildings as just giant sets of networks. It's as if you're inside a smartphone now, right? We use our smartphones and we, marvel at all the things we could do in it. Well, imagine if your whole building can behave in ways to support and amplify what you do. So when you do these engagements, which is what your original question was, it really kind of depends on the facility, right? So if you're building something for a tenant or an office building, it is around, say, productivity and the ability for you to run a business if you're a bank or another kind of company. But what if you're a factory? Those also qualify. So how do you create a factory that is, thinking for itself and having certain levels of robotics, but also understanding how to optimize what humans can do across there. And that's even become even more of a challenge as we're looking at the complexities of supply chains right now. So supply chains are closely related to it. And then there's, say, another scenario. We do a lot with sports arenas. And this idea that you think of large populations coming in for specific times and events to have the best experience possible. And that could be the sports feature that they've come to see. It could be perhaps an entertainment venue that they've seen. How do they locate where their seat is? How do they get the best food service? How do they know if their bathrooms are safe and clean? How do they locate quickly others that they want to meet? How do they enter that building? Some of these sports venues actually have train stations that are underneath running. And so how do you sync up your tickets to the time of your train? There's lots of things that you can do. And then there's the whole facilities management side for any of these places that the owners and the operators of these facilities, they want command and control centers so that they can optimize the experience and create a more valuable asset and experience across there. It's a huge area. And if we think about, cities themselves and the importance of what's happening right now, we all talk about, pollution or we need more things that are sustainable and green, but we also want less congestion in traffic. We want to make sure that there's safety. Buildings themselves were the biggest thing that were impacted when COVID hit, right? Because we couldn't go back into the workplace. So how was that all going to, sort itself out through there? The energy signatures of buildings, and as I said before, or at least earlier, the creation of a building to then the operation of the building, that's about 40% of your greenhouse gases that are coming out. Now, if you take transportation, whether it's transportation of what it was needed to either create the buildings or the transportation to use the buildings, that kicks up another 30% of the greenhouse gases. So your cities, if you can solve for this in an intelligent way, you are going to solve 70% of what we're all trying to do, getting towards carbon net neutral zero. Other things are very, very difficult. But buildings and transportation are key. Smart buildings have this ability to have an immediate impact, and they always have throughout history. I could say, a smart system 1,000 years ago would have been putting fountains in Rome so that you had clean public water, in central places. Or the first clock towers, that were put, back in medieval times, so people knew what time of day it was, and they knew, how to have longer work days or start to see education take place. So we go through various times, in our history, and if you think about buildings in our own time, they're the laggards, right? We've applied technology on and on through our devices, through our computers, through our cars, through our homes with nests and things like that. But buildings have been a laggard, but the buildings are where we spend something like 90% of our time. I think that's the last statistic I saw was that we spend 90% of our time in buildings. We spend 6% of our time in transportation and cars, and we spend 3% of our time outside, which is kind of depressing if you think about it, right? So
It is. It
the
is.
fact that buildings are lagging in technology, and the fact that we can make them smarter, which just benefits us all, it's about time.
Now, speaking of laggards, you mentioned smart spaces. I think first pillar was assets. You gave an example of IoT. Second was user experience. The third one, sustainability. How have you seen the attitudes from leadership in organizations change, specifically when it comes to sustainability?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I still think it has to be resolved. I think we've certainly have seen fits and starts of sustainability and where it gets to the board level or leadership. Like I said, I'm very fortunate that I work for a company that understood this. Back in 2008 is when we really started looking at it and started our journey. It took 10 years for us to achieve our carbon neutrality. We made a commitment in 2011 after we had defined the problem statement with the UN. So this is actually 5, 6 years before the Paris agreements that we started taking carbon out of our systems, going across there. And so it was a 10-year journey for us. I think that with world events, I think part of it is political, but also I think COVID also kind of brought to light what happens when a situation doesn't recognize borders or countries' wealth as much, as opposed to what impacts everybody. No matter how wealthy you might be as an economy, if you don't solve it for the world, it's never going to be solved, and it's going to continue. So I think that lesson was understood, along with the fact that when we really had to say, I can take technology and innovation and come up with a vaccine or come up with protocols and governance to start to control an emergency situation like this. People are really smart, and the ability, to come up with that show that you can do these things. I think at the same time, the imperatives that we've seen from climate change in particular, and the quality of life, and the large moves of populations, has also alerted companies to say, where should they be located? Where's that workforce going to be? What are the products that are going to be able to activate in a supply chain of value coming across there? Was a big motivation. I think in Europe, in particular, when they formally announced that board compensation was going to be tied to ESG metrics. So that's ESG, environment, social, and governance, which is our definition of sustainability. Then it really started to matter, right? Because now, as a board member, you are having influencers that are saying companies must start behaving in certain ways. When you see the rebuilds of the economy right now, traditionally economies after a downturn will either build out in two ways. Either it'll be infrastructure, which we're hearing a lot about right now, or it'll be military. It says, okay, we're going to beef up our ability to have our way. And I think this time around, with infrastructure, we're saying, guess what? Sustainability has to be there. We have to look at renewables. We have to understand the advances of what's happening with mobility. You need to understand the implications of coastal changes in water levels, because that's where most major cities are located. 94% of the population lives within 100 miles of the coast. So what happens if water raises up 2 or 3 feet? We're all facing big questions. So I think companies are realizing that in order to stay relevant, in order to attract workforces, in order to be part of the solution and not part of the problem, that mandate has now reached the board level. And for sustainability, it's really two ways to look at it. And sometimes we refer to it as scope 1, 2, and 3, but it's two ways. One is, what do you do with your own operations? What are you doing for your own company in order to become more sustainable? And then the second major part is, what do I do with my supply chain of who I get involved with, right? Whether I'm creating things through that supply chain or whether I'm delivering through that supply chain. That is not a requirement with sustainability. And when I refer to those three scopes, so that first scope is your operations. It's everything that you do within your buildings with your people and all of that coming across there. Scope two is, what is the energy and carbon output that you're dealing with, right? So do I choose to use renewable energies? Do I have certain rules around transportation of how people come in? And those are scope twos. Scope threes are everything in your supply chain. It says all of your suppliers will meet certain standards so that you all kind of head into this carbon neutrality zone of decarbonization or climate control in other areas. And that's where it gets really complex. But businesses are making conscious decisions of who they work with and who they do not work with, because now that compensation is tied to it, now that there's huge contracts out there for infrastructure rebuilds, now that the population of workers are saying, I'll choose this product over this other product because I feel it's more sustainable. It really has hit a crescendo right now, and hopefully we'll stick with it.
Let's double click on scope three. I think it's called all other indirect emissions from activities.
Mm-hmm.
How does Infosys, first of all, probably a designer's dream, but how does Infosys help companies get a view on those additional, emissions or regulations requirements?
Yeah, part of it is through certainly assessments, and it's certainly through big data problem sets. But I think what's more interesting about this question is, if you think about the SDGs, so the 17 SDGs, they are the UN guidelines, right?
Hmm.
And companies can choose which of those SDGs they want to do, right? So some companies will form alliances to say we agree to these together for certain reasons, but it's still optional which ones you choose. And then you have this option of saying, and how much of this will I do? So what I mean by that is, if I take the SDG on greenhouse emissions and carbon emissions, I can say, yeah, but my goal will be to reduce it by 20 or 30%. There's no law saying you must reduce it by 90%, right? So it's kind of optional what you're saying. So one of the challenges that companies have, we all have, is how do I select my metrics? And then how do I report out on those metrics in a recognizable form? And it's one of the first big challenges. So what Infosys often will work with companies, and why there's, I think, a large trust, is the fact that when we say that we're net carbon neutral, we have done that without purchasing credits. We've done this through technology. We've done this through choosing different kinds of renewable energy. We've done this through our building designs, as I've talked about. We've done this through community corporate social responsibility programs to boost up economies. And this allows us to get to our carbon net neutral component. So when companies are saying they need to look at that scope three, which is very, very complex, right? Because if you think about scope three as that supply chain, and they're saying, I need to remove carbon out of my supply chain, how can you get enough information out of your supply chain that you can actually prove that you're doing it, right? Because just because they're in your supply chain doesn't mean you're going to have access to all their data. That's really up to an agreement that you would go forward with. And then how do you verify that? And truly, for sustainability, it has to be third-party verified in order for it to pass the auditing across there. So what we have done is we've created a set of tools that are basically big data tools that would allow for the collection of that data, whether it's put in by hand, but hopefully it's more put in through IoT devices or automation, so that data can be aggregated and that you can get a true picture of things. And take down another step down. Some data is very quantitative in nature, right? So environmental data, greenhouse gases, energy signatures, climate, those are tangible things. But sustainability, as I said before, is also social and governance. So when you're at a social level and you're talking about diversity or inclusivity, or if you're looking at governance, those could be more qualitative in manners. And then it becomes very subjective, right, of how that's being reported out across there. And so what we try to do is, just like with the digital transformation program was years ago, until you can move those into centralized ERP systems of record, they're not quantifiable. So we try to help companies take their digital agendas, also take the kinds of information that we can get out of them in that system and move it into centralized systems so that they can be auditable across there. That's the theory behind it. That is the activity. Where this gets very complex, though, is if you think of what supply chains are in sustainability, it's about circularity. So circularity is basically saying, this little waste in as a little waste out, right? As we think about, down that entire supply chain. And that goes everything from the energy to when you're thinking about designing a product. How do I think about reuse and recycling from the beginning? How do I think about transport? How do I think about reverse logistics? How do I know if the companies that I'm working for are compliant? And they're all going to fumble and stumble, and we do too. So how do they deal with resilience across there? So the thing that we have come up with are lightweight ways of collecting data that can work on top of other systems, that can be audited properly, and that could be used for valuations, but it also could be used for measurements. The other thing that we have done is we've created assessments for large supply chains to at least say, this is the baseline. This is where your suppliers are, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3, where they are in their journeys. And then what can we do over a period of time to move them up the value chain or to take them out of the supply chain if it's not going to be a good partner for them. And then have the ability for not just that data collection, but to set like a group goal that says out of your supply chain over a year or 2 years, we're going to take out 20 or 30% of the carbon across there. And we'll do that on a performance-based contract that basically says, we'll take the supply chain, we'll get you to this goal. And if we don't do it to this levels, then we don't get compensated in a proper way. And what starts to happen is that you start getting alignment of the bigger picture. And instead of just playing the game of I get credits or I'm offsetting my carbon in certain ways, you actually are physically taking carbon out of the system across there. Surprisingly, you can achieve this. We've seen this now in 3 to 6 months if with the right kinds of opportunities come across there. When I talk to companies, and I see these goals that they say, as an individual company, we're setting a goal for 2040 or 2050 to take out 50% of our carbon and whatever. That's very realistic for large companies like that do a lot of materials like a Dow or others, right? But when you're in an information or technology culture and everybody's into technology now, we were able to do this in 10 years, right? To take our entire company and do this. And our supply chain. I believe having started that in 2011 and achieving that 2 years ago, what we know now and the technologies that we have now, I believe you can achieve this in 7 years. You easily shave 3 years off that cycle if you have the will to do this, and it's not even so much a large investment because these programs themselves are usually funded. There's a lot of mechanisms in the investment community right now to support this whole movement.
It sounds like at the core of what you're speaking about is a shift in thinking. And I had a guest on the show 2 years ago, and he spoke about circular thinking. And his question, which he poses to his clients, is what if you start out with the statement, we are going to have no waste. There's going to be no waste. So no cradle to grave, all cradle to cradle. And if we start with that thinking, where can we go from here?
I agree with that completely. And, one of the keys, I'm sure many of your listeners or viewers have heard about is science-based targets, right? So these are targets that have scientific, foundations in them. And the key to doing a science-based target of saying, I'm going to take out carbon, and it has to be scientifically proven, is you take an ambitious goal. And it's almost just on the edge of impossible. But you take this scientific, you take an ambitious goal, and it forces you to say, what are all the things that I can do? Do I need to really put in solar fields? Can I, find other ways of energy? Can I really rethink of not using plastics at all? Can I perhaps take my leftovers from my supply chain and move it to somebody else's supply chain where they can use these products across here? And unless you strive for those ambitious goals, you're never going to achieve it. And you probably won't get perfect. You probably will, fall short in some areas, but you'll make much more progress than if you just set a low-hanging fruit target across there. So I agree with that with completely with circularity. Absolutely.
And again, it sounds like a dream for a design thinker.
It is, and I'll tell you what's interesting. I think about design is I think one of the things that we do. We know ultimately for things to really work. I keep on using the word science, and maybe discuss my background, but it has to scientifically work, right? If the science isn't there, you can't capture and store carbon, or you can't really create safe air quality environments. It's just not something to say, well, I think I can do this, so I'm going to write some software. There has to be scientific proof, that the technology works through there. But the majority of the world doesn't have access to those scientists, right? Or to the level that you could say, I'm putting scientists on my staff to go do this. So I believe that companies like Infosys are a great bridge of both real science and then what I call practical calculus, which says, how do I take all of those equations and all of that hard science and turn that into usable formulas and frameworks, right, that can be deployed by large parts of the population, whether they're technologists, whether they're designers, whether they're business folks, whether they're data scientists. But if we can take those formulas and make them usable so that inventors can move fast and actually solve for this, you need both. And I think that's often a bridge of what we do. That's when we talk about sustainability, we call it practical sustainability. Things that you actually can do that can happen in a timely enough manner across there and have immediate impact.
So, speaking of usable frameworks and practical sustainability, you have a book coming out in a couple of months. It's called Practical Sustainability, Circular Commerce, Smarter Spaces, and Happier Humans. What do you hope to accomplish with the book?
First of all, thank you for the plug. It's always appreciated. But yeah, so what the goal of the book is that we actually have this idea that says, how do we share frameworks and how do we create the narratives around what we're talking about here? So often the ability to go ahead and execute on what we're talking about for sustainability or large problem sets can be very daunting and complex. So the idea of the book was to say, look, there are things that we have from experience, and we've talked to, I'd say, at least 30 renowned external folks. This isn't an Infosys book, actually. It's a book that myself and Jeff Kavanaugh co-wrote and co-designed, was the idea to say, we believe that we can make a difference by sharing knowledge, and that there were frameworks that we have seen both from our business situations and from science institutions that we've worked with, and then having ourselves work for a company that achieved these goals that said, let's share this knowledge as much as we can. But it couldn't be a deep research book, technically, because that would take years and years to do it right. And we said, what can we do as designers, as consultants, as technologists that says, you know what, I can help you figure out how to take out that carbon with realistic steps that you can go through. So the goal of the book was to create these narratives. There are specific areas, sustainability is large. That title itself, it's not maybe the best title in the world because it has so many words in it. We said 3 or 4 things that we can impact was circular commerce is something that every company, every country, and every government has to understand. So let's address that. Let's address spaces because, as I said before, everybody uses spaces and that would have a huge impact for everybody. And of course, how do we make sure that humans are in the equation and that they're benefiting from it? And so we kept it to that scope. And we've put in close to 60 frameworks that are usable right now that you could take and you could run an exercise and you could say, this is how I could think about starting a program, or this is how carbon economy would work. Or this is how, if I were to invest in a smart space, what would it take to measure my space? What would it take to actually retrofit or build a new space? And when could I see my ROI on this? And then where are the steps across there? And I'm hoping that it will be used by several levels. One is the fact that if you're a practitioner that is fortunate enough to be able to deliver these kinds of services, it's an honor actually, it would give you frameworks that you could then build upon yourself. Secondly, if you are, say, a city manager or a mayor and you're saying, I have to make decisions around energy policies or understand what the infrastructure bills are about, this will help you at least hopefully make some decisions and understand what you're getting into across there. And then hopefully the most important thing that I hope happens out of this is that we've had several large academic institutions contribute, and they have high interest in this, and they're talking about creating courseware based off of these components so that this next generation of students, kind of going back to why aren't there enough designers in there? So how do we start training and building that next set of workforce around sustainability? And I believe that these frameworks will allow these institutions to create courses eventually, that will take off and hopefully build this next generation of thinkers for us.
Well, I look forward to reading it when it comes out. So I'm going to get to the crux of our conversation. You've mentioned a few times this passion for design throughout your career. Now you're engaging in sustainability. Why sustainability? What drew you to that? Why is that important to you?
Well, I think first off, I think most of us are very drawn to sustainability, right? I think there's very few people, on the planet that would say that sustainability is not an attractive idea or a concept or something that you want to be on the right side of the ledger on. I'll tell you what actually drew me into this current role. It was given to me. So I was working on my smart spaces practice, other practice, and I get this call saying, hey, we need you to take over the sustainability because I have a penchant for building things. I build businesses and build units, and they're saying, this is something that we think you could do very well. And I was thinking, this is really excellent, right? Because it's something that I feel fortunate enough to say, I'm working on things that I can actually maybe explain to somebody now, right? In our field in technology, often we're working on these systems that you really can't explain to your relatives or your friends, what is it that you do in a living other than your technology? Now you can actually tell people, well, I'm reducing greenhouse gases, or I'm taking plastics out of the ocean, or I am, using renewable energies. Those are the easy answers. The more complex answers are actually, what are you doing with diversity and social, equity? Or how are you dealing with governance on boards coming across there? So these become very complex sets of problems. This kind of goes back to design. So we do, or I do, and we put this forward, is this idea of applied systems design. How do you take complex systems and start to have them organized and behave in certain patterns? How do you break a problem down that's both physical, digital, social, environmental, all of these governance wise, and how can you start to align these so that you can achieve certain goals? So sustainability is not just such a relevant, important thing to be working on, but it's an extremely interesting, complex set of problems to solve for. And unlike other waves of technology that I've been fortunate to be involved in, usually as technology evolves and becomes more advanced, you will find a simplification pattern, right? We try to get velocity. We try to make low code, no code. We make our interfaces easier to use, right, for adoption. What happens with sustainability is like every time you solve one piece of this, it's like throwing a pebble in the pond and all these other ripples start to happen. You're saying, okay, I've just, moved this from here to here, and that caused 10 more big things I need to solve through there. And every time you do that, it happens again. And what I often, when I relate to other individuals, my peers in the field here, we talk about a couple of events that we see that are very common. Everybody agrees that sustainability is huge. We also recognize that it's not like it's the next technology wave. It's not like, okay, well, here's cloud coming or here's mobility coming and there's going to be a whole bunch of new players and new technologies. Sustainability is more about, this is the age of sustainability, where everything about our lives and business are there. So it goes beyond traditional ways that technology companies think about things, and every kind of company thinks about it. The other thing that's been really amazing is that almost every company is placing some pretty serious resources behind their sustainability, and usually at the senior management level, at the CEO level, CO level, chief sustainability officer level, chief procurement level. Those individuals that I have met in all these organizations are amazing individuals. They are not just amazing because of the knowledge they have, but each company seems to be putting somebody in place who is also highly, highly competent and successful in creating organizational change, or has built major, major parts of businesses. So unlike past times where maybe a technology company might have to educate or help guide a company to say, how do I make good technology decisions, or what will this technology do for me, and where's the business value? We are meeting sets of individuals who get this and who not only get why companies do this, but have been empowered to make companies do this. And that has been, a remarkable set of individuals. It's like almost every first discussion you have, what you might start off thinking, this is a discussion, are we going to do business together? Automatically turns into a 360-degree relationship where we're just explaining what common goals are companies good fits for each other, do we have shared values? Those become the important discussions across there. And that's been fascinating.
Which sounds like it's going to be a lifelong endeavor.
I'm not the first one to say this. I'm going to say, at least for myself, for the next 15 years, it will be the busiest and most interesting 15 years. And I would say that there's a lot of work, that's going to take place. And I'd say at least once a month, I hear of a project or a concept that I never would have dreamed of before. Than saying, we're going to do what? And it's just fascinating to try to solve those problems and then realize that they have a real possibility of actually, taking place. And it's really, like I said, an amazing position and opportunity. What people need to realize is that these roles don't just reside with me, right? I'm, chief sustainability officer in a company. Everybody in the company has this ability, right, to be that impactful player. It goes back to the Fred Rogers thing. Do what you can at the level that you can, and there's no stopping you, right? And everybody every day can do something that moves it in a direction, whether it's in their personal life or whether it's in their business life. There are no rules that are telling you that you shouldn't be doing something in this direction.
I totally agree with that. Now, it sounds like you spent quite a bit of time in introspection. You've had quite a scenic journey on your career. What are a couple of the most valuable lessons you've learned about yourself on your journey?
Yeah, so I would say I'll probably keep these more as maybe just general rules to live by or painful lessons learned. Often when I talk to people, things that I've learned. So I think one of the most valuable skills that a leader or a manager can have, and a leader should be at all levels, is the ability to make decisions. And this is not an original concept or thought, but it's something I thoroughly believe in. So the very best thing that you can do is make the right decision. The second best thing you can do is make the wrong decision. And the third thing that you can do is not make a decision at all. That's worse than making the wrong decision. And so often I think about that when we go through there. I also constantly think about how to reinvent yourself every 3 years, whether that means you have to move to another company or just reinventing yourself within that company. I know that we have a tendency to say, well, what's my career path? And, we work to certain KPIs and goals across there, but I've never in my career ever worried about what my next role was going to be. I always have been able to create my roles, and I found other individuals can do that too. You can make yourself be very valuable to a group of people or to companies, and also align it to things that you want to be doing or things that you think are important through there. So I think that's really important. I think it's also important not to freeze in time. So if you get very successful at something, you need to always look for a new challenge. And that's part of that reinvention part. Often we're victims of our own success. We tend to do things very well. We get continued work in that same direction because we're known for doing those things well. And then that's what you end up doing. So how do you not freeze in time? Which means you should step aside sometimes and let others, take over the lead, even if you might think you might know how to do it better. That's never really the case. If we think about it, when we're most productive, I know I kind of hit my stride somewhere between the ages of 27 and 35. And that was many years ago, where I could say I was having an impact and getting enough control that I felt I could take credit or work with teams to do so. And I think sometimes we forget, as we have longer careers now in society, that there's a whole generation of individuals that are coming out that have to be given leadership roles, and you don't have to wait till you're 45 or 50 to say I can lead a group or a division. So it's important not to freeze in time, and it's important to, I'd say, manage up and manage down. Make sure the people that are working for you have the incredible opportunities that you've had. And then how do you manage upwards, to constantly, push management up above you, because we're all in line somewhere, to continue to change as needs to go across there. Another lesson is just because you're capable of doing something doesn't mean you should always do it. That's right. So there's lessons there that I won't go into. Sometimes, we're a company that feels we can build everything and anything, and I think we can, but it doesn't always make the sense to do so. So I think that's important to understand ecosystems. I think also nothing is ever perfect. It never will be perfect. Often when I'm asking groups to solve in hackathons, I do a lot of teaching with students and grad students. We'll give them a problem set to solve in 3 or 4 days. That'll be very complex. And I'll say, the first thing is make sure your technology actually works, which is kind of against what you think designers would say. But if the technology is not working, then everything else won't work because you can't trust the data or anything that's happening across there. The second one is that realize that once you start solving for a problem set, you're never going to have enough resources or time that you thought you were going to have. So you're going to have to think your way through that. And if you do it, you're probably going to end up with a better design anyway, right? Because you're forced to change things. And then the third is to make sure that your ideas are big enough and bold enough that they're going to survive, all the challenges along the way. And that's what's going to keep it going across there. So understanding that nothing is ever perfect, and those are the realities of life, I think you'll do pretty well in most things that you try to do. Just one more. So diversity and inclusion. I know those are hot words right now because of sustainability and what we're looking at from the ESG perspective. But I made a conscious decision after working for some of the world's largest corporations to join a company that wasn't Western-based or Western European-based. And I intentionally joined a company that had a very different culture because I felt that it was a time for me to look at the world differently. And I would recommend that to everybody, that you should constantly be looking to challenge yourself and see through other people's eyes of what's going on through there and be very open to it. And I think you'll grow better for it. So those would be the lessons that I've learned.
Corey, all great lessons. Make sure your ideas are big enough, bold enough, and challenge yourself. I wish you great success with the book, and I look forward to catching up with you again soon.
Well, thank you, Raj. I really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation.
Thank you. Thank you for listening. If you like our show, please give us a rating and review on iTunes. And you can show your support by sharing our show with a friend or reach out to us on social media, where you'll find us under our Nexus PMG handle. If there's a subject or topic you'd like to hear about, send me an email, btu@nexuspmg.com, or contact me via our website, nexuspmg.com. And while you're there, you can sign up for our monthly newsletter, where we share what we're reading and thinking about in the clean tech, green tech sectors. Bigger Than Us is a Nexus PMG production.